pose a couple of questions for us to think through this topic of gender-based violence. The first being public space. How do we define public space? Is it in any space that's not home? Do we assume that homes are safe? If not homes, are we thinking in terms of roads, markets, workspaces? What is public? What constitutes public? And as a citizen, how do I position myself in all these public spaces that are guaranteed by to me by the Indian Constitution? So first question is, what does public count as? The second question I want to think about is in terms of violence. To me, as a researcher that works on dignity, dignity is a right that is guaranteed, and that is a right that extends before the birth and continues post my death, right? And any act that impinges on dignity is an act of violence. It could be a gaze, it could be a word, it could be everyday acts of microaggression. It could be a touch, it could be a feel, it could be any act that impinges on my dignity, that those also violences. And finally, we have a lot of conversations about rape and honor killings. But I want to focus on these everyday acts, everyday gazes, and everyday words in public spaces, which I would count as very normalized acts of violence. And the third is gender. Today, we are talking about non binary gender, a gender fluid state. And when we talk about gender, are we just talking about men and women? Are we talking about the dominant position of men over women, right? And gender is actually an intersectional concept. It just, while there are concepts, it says patriarchy provides power to all men, but I would like to question it. I'd really like to question it. Because in the intersectionality of the caste, class, positions, men sometimes also face violence in the hands of women. So patriarchy does not mean that, I mean, it really doesn't mean that all men are powerful and all women are not powerful enough to cause danger or have acts of violence against the other. So for me, it is that intersectionality of gender, it's an intersectionality of caste, politics, social position, multiple things, which provides dominance to a person against the other who is in the receiving end of the acts of violence. So those are the three broad questions: gender, public space, and what's violence. When we explicate it in this broad uh, dimensions, then it becomes important for us to understand what are the drivers of this violence. Is it so driven in us as part of our culture, we normalize it, or is it something that happens that we are taught in our schools and colleges and workplace, or is it something in the it's a personal act that can be corrected? To understand the drivers becomes important for us. And lastly, I would like to think about how do we engage with the stakeholders? Who are the real stakeholders here? Is it the person for whom I'm designing the safe space? If so, who am I? And who's the person I'm designing the safe spaces for? Who are these citizens? And what is my role as an elite, privileged person designing spaces for the other? Do I even understand their stories? Am I able to visualize their experiences of violence? And what is my positionality with respect to the citizens for whom I'm designing it? Are we hearing their voices? Are we having a conversation with the us? And why are we not inviting them in these discussion forum? Where is their position in this table? That's a question I want to throw open. The second is designing spaces seems to be a very powerful act of dominance. Who's designing for whom? How are we even engaging with the stakeholders? Stakeholders who are going to be users, stakeholders who are going to be policy makers, and stakeholders who are decision makers in terms of politics. How are we doing it? And how do we envision this happening? Those are questions that we wish to engage in this workshop. Another interesting thought that came across was about physical public spaces and virtual public spaces. Today, all of us are part of the virtual systems, either through our mobile phones, internet connections, or multiple ways where we are virtually present and we are global citizens. How do we ensure safety in those virtual spaces? How do we ensure our voices are heard and we are respected in those public spaces where we are many ways part of a corporate engagement, where we are merely numbers in a large big data analytical view, right? Where I'm just a number. How do we ensure safety in digital spaces is another concern. So when we talk in terms of safety, I would like to think both physical safety and virtual safety. Third, this constant gaze, omnipresent, omniscient state and corporate spaces, which monitors every action, every move, either for profits or for votes. How can we even define what is safety in these spaces? Becomes a question that we need to engage in. That's a very interesting question. These are large problems, right? That has impact across human beings. It's just not one or it's not two, and it has a transnational implication, right? Public space is just not decided by the country's boundaries, but goes way beyond it. So, how do we build bridges? It's a great question, and it's a fairly troublesome question to answer. I had somebody saying what was done in 5,000 years can't be undone in 50 years. I don't think it can be done in 5 days, for sure. So building bridges for me starts with knowing what are the breakpoints. Right? So the first is, how do we let the users talk for themselves instead of assuming academics, policymakers, and politicians know who the constituents are, who the citizens are? How do we ensure user voices are heard in places that matter? Second, how do we ensure policies are inclusive and not in a very theoretical way of inclusive where we have a few discussions heard and then it gets written away as a policy material or a public policy, but really involve people in design. We do have some examples where we have collectives coming together to design their own spaces. Can we do that? And the third is, definitely we need to engage with the political actors, both Indian and global. Ultimately, they have both the power given to them by the electorate, which voted them into power across the world. Right? We need to engage with them. And how do we engage with them to ensure the voices are heard and the bridges are built? Is what I would say. Users, policy implementers, and the leaders. All three are important for me. In that, there is a role for um, civil society organizations to ensure the voices are heard, to create collectives so that the collective voices are heard. Definitely a role for researchers in coming up with evidence based, evidence backed policies. And there is a role for collective action to create political parties, and the voices are heard by people who matter. So I think there is a role for civil society organizations, there is a role for researchers to influence policy, and definitely for people to do what is right for them, not only now, but in the long run as well. So, broadly, those are my suggestions.